In this episode of SCI Show and Minute Earth, we are going to talk about how the first Americans got here. Okay, before we get started, I have an exciting announcement. We are just 999,995 subscribers short of hitting that 1 million subscriber milestone. If you're not already subscribed, join us now and stay up to date with all of our latest videos. Also stick around until the end of this video for more information about our special subscriber event we are doing to celebrate. Thanks for being awesome. Alright, let's get to the science. People have been exploring North America for thousands of years, and we know today that the continent was first inhabited by humans across many different migration events that happened over the course of tens of thousands of years. But one question that scientists still haven't been able to answer definitively is, how did the first Americans get here? There are two main theories, and both involve a journey over water. The first theory says that people arrived in North America by walking across what is now the southernmost part of the Isthmus of Panama. At the time, they would have been walking on land because approximately 15,000 years ago, during the peak of the last ice age, the sea level was around 100 meters lower than it is today. That exposed a land bridge connecting the continents of North and South America. So the idea is that modern humans from South America made their way northward along this exposed land bridge, eventually arriving in North America. The second theory says that people arrived by boat. They either sailed directly across the Caribbean or they island hopped up the Pacific coast of what is now the Americas. Which theory is correct could impact our understanding of pre-Columbian history, because it would tell us a lot about the technological capabilities of the first Americans. If they walked across the isthmus, then that would suggest that they were less technologically advanced because it would have been easier to travel on foot. But if they used boats to get here, then that suggests they had developed the technology necessary to build a vessel capable of traveling across open water. And so far, the evidence seems to support the idea that the first Americans did use boats. The idea that the first Americans traveled by boat has been around since at least the 1960s, when archaeologists found stone tools on islands off the coast of Ecuador and Chile that seemed too sophisticated to have been carried there by ocean currents. The tools were made by pressure flaking, which is a technique that requires a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between the shape of a rock, its environment, and the desired outcome. Basically, you have to know what you're doing in order to make these kinds of tools. So how did they get there? Well, the researchers proposed that early humans built boats and then sailed them across the ocean. But the problem is that there isn't much archaeological evidence left of these hypothetical boats, because most boats aren't made out of things that preserve well, like wood or leather. Boats tend to be made out of materials like reeds and grasses that decompose quickly, leaving behind no trace for archaeologists to find. And so it's been hard to say whether or not early people were capable of building boats. But there is another piece of evidence that might help solve the mystery. In 2017, archaeologists in Chile discovered a site that turned out to be one of the oldest in the Americas. The site contained stone tools and other artifacts that suggested humans had been living there at least 14,500 years ago. What's remarkable about this site is that it's located on an island called Mocha Island, which is 23 kilometers off the coast of Chile. Getting there would have required crossing open ocean in a boat. And that makes this site one of the strongest pieces of evidence we have for the idea that the first Americans got here by boat. But while it does seem likely that the first Americans did arrive in boats, exactly where they came from and how they got here is still an open question. One team of researchers thinks that the first Americans sailed from a region in what is now northwest South America known as the Ecuadorian coast. To come up with this conclusion, they examined the skeletons of two people who lived in this region roughly 13,000 years ago. The researchers wanted to figure out what these individuals ate by analyzing the chemical makeup of their bones. You see, when you eat food, some of the isotopes in that food get incorporated into your tissue. Carbon and nitrogen are two of the most commonly used stable isotopes in archaeology and paleoecology. When organisms die, those isotopes break down in predictable ways, which allows scientists to learn about what they ate near the end of their lives. And specifically, they can learn whether or not those organisms primarily ate land plants or marine organisms. Like most animals, terrestrial plants have carbon and nitrogen that breaks down into mostly 12 carbon and 14 nitrogen. Marine organisms, on the other hand, have carbon and nitrogen that breaks down into mostly 13 carbon and 15 nitrogen. So by looking at the ratios of these isotopes in a person's bones, you can tell whether they got most of their calories from land or sea. The further you are north, the more 13 carbon and 15 nitrogen tends to be in the tissues of local people. Using this method, researchers analyzed the bones of people from 4 sites along the Ecuadorian coast, 2 from roughly 13,000 years ago and 2 from roughly 3,000 years ago. The researchers wanted to compare these two time periods to see if there was a difference in diet over time. After all, if the coastal people relied heavily on the ocean for food, then you would expect to see more 13 carbon and 15 nitrogen in the bones of ancient people compared to more recent people. But instead, they found the opposite. People from 13,000 years ago had less 13 carbon and 15 nitrogen than people from just 3,000 years ago. This suggests that the coastal people only started eating more seafood 3,000 years ago. Instead, the researchers proposed that before this time, the people who lived on the coast were actually getting most of their calories from plants that grew along the coast, like shellfish and seaweed. Shellfish and seaweed have carbon and nitrogen isotopes that fall somewhere in between what we see in land plants and what we see in other marine organisms. And so the people from 13,000 years ago should have had carbon and nitrogen isotopes that reflect that. But there is another explanation for why the people from 13,000 years ago didn't have more 13 carbon and 15 nitrogen in their bones. Maybe they got most of their calories from fish. Fish tend to have lower levels of 13 carbon and 15 nitrogen than other marine organisms because they eat phytoplankton, and phytoplankton tend to have very low levels of 13 carbon and 15 nitrogen. So it looks like the people who lived in what is now the Ecuadorian coast 13,000 years ago may have gotten most of their calories from fish. But that raises another question. If they ate fish, then they probably lived near the coast. But the two sites where researchers found their skeletons were inland. That is a problem because it is unlikely that two different groups of people who lived inland would have independently chosen to eat mostly fish. It's more likely that one group moved inland but continued to rely on the ocean for food. And if that's true, then it means that the first Americans almost certainly had boats because it would have been difficult to transport fish over land without them. Now, the researchers acknowledge that they can't prove that these people definitely got their protein from fish instead of from shellfish or seaweed. They also acknowledge that it's possible that other factors, like seasonal droughts, impacted the isotopic composition of the people's bones. But their results do paint a pretty clear picture of a society that was sophisticated enough to go out into open ocean in search of food. And if people in this region were sailing out into open ocean 13,000 years ago, then it makes sense that they would have been the ones to sail across the ocean to reach North America. This particular study hasn't settled the debate, but it is one of the strongest pieces of evidence we have for the idea that the first Americans arrived here by boat. And it tells us something about the kind of boat they may have used. Because based on this research, it doesn't seem likely that they would have used a large sailing vessel, which would have required more advanced technology. Instead, they probably used something like a dugout canoe, a boat made by hollowing out the trunk of a large tree. Dugout canoes are simple to make and require few resources, suggesting that they would have been easy to replicate across cultures. And so the evidence is beginning to point towards a scenario where the first Americans crossed the Pacific Ocean in small boats, perhaps as part of an extensive migration that happened roughly 13,000 years ago. During the Ice Age, the ocean voyage would have been shorter too, because the sea level was lower. But despite the evidence pointing towards boats, there's still no consensus among experts. And some experts continue to debate whether or not people could have walked across the isthmus after all. Either way, we are still working to fill in the gaps in our knowledge about the first Americans. And maybe someday soon we'll be able to say exactly how they got here. Speaking of knowledge gaps, there is a gap in our knowledge about whether or not you're subscribed. So please don't leave us hanging. Go ahead and hit subscribe and then watch this video about ancient DNA or this video about the universe.